Hi, in this video we're going to have an introduction to the biomolecules, including a focus on carbon, why it's important to them, and the functional groups. There are common groups of molecules in living things. These aren't small molecules like water, salt, or carbon dioxide, but these are molecules made of dozens or hundreds of atoms. For example, vitamin B2, known as riboflavin, has many atoms involved, as we can see in the diagram. We can call these larger common groups of molecules in living things the macromolecules, macro meaning large, or the biomolecules. Four groups of these include the carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. When we start talking about the biomolecules, we're talking about organic molecules. Generally, that means they're built around carbon. If we look at carbon, we can see that it has 6 electrons. There are 2 in the first orbital, and that leaves 4 in the outer orbital. By the octet rule, that means that it needs 4 more valence electrons to bond with things. This is part of what makes carbon important to all organic molecules in life. It's happy to bond with 4 other things. This allows it to have many versatile shapes. It bonds with other carbon atoms, hydrogen, sulfur, nitrogen, and other elements found in living things. By itself, carbon can form connected sheets in graphite, as we see here, or it can be reinforced in all directions in diamonds. But we're talking about in living things. In organisms, carbon forms rings or long carbon chains that serve as the backbone for these organic molecule groups. Now, beyond carbon, we can talk about hydrocarbons. These are compounds made of only hydrogen and carbon. For example, we see methane, ethane, propane, butane, and benzene rings. These are some small, simple hydrocarbons. And there are many others. Now, when we say that organic means that there's carbon involved, it can be a little bit more complicated. Consider limestone. It's just a naturally occurring rock, and it's not alive, but it does have carbon in it. Or consider Teflon, something made in a laboratory, an interesting compound that's very stable and is hard for other compounds to bond with or interact with Teflon, which is why it's a coating in non-stick pans. There's lots of carbon in there, but it's definitely not something that's alive. On the other hand, nitric oxide has no carbon. It has a nitrogen and oxygen, but it's an important signaling molecule involved in blood flow. So it's part of life, but it doesn't have carbon. We can see the definition of organic is a little more complicated than just saying carbon is involved. We could also consider carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, cyanide, or calcium carbide, which is Ca and C2, which is found in the old miner lamps, with a little flame of acetylene that comes off of the calcium carbide. Those complicate the definition of what it means to be organic. The point is that carbon forms chains, rings, and branching complex shapes and even layered sheets that makes it at the heart of what it means to be an organic molecule. Also, when we talk about organic molecules, we're not talking about something you might see in an advertisement or the grocery store. This is a separate definition from the agricultural definition of organic food. After we know what carbon is important for, we can look at the large molecules in living things having a carbon backbone or skeleton. Then beyond that, we have functional groups, which are common groups of atoms attached to carbon backbones. So again, here's some hydrocarbons, and we can see the skeleton or central chain of carbon atoms. When we have functional groups off of carbon backbones, it changes the properties of the chemicals involved. So ethane is a colorless, odorless gas. On the other hand, if we add an oxygen and hydrogen, known as the OH group, it's a functional group. This changes the properties of ethane to what we call ethanol, commonly called grain alcohol. This is now a colorless, volatile, flammable liquid. When we show structural diagrams of molecules, R can represent a variable in these structural formulas. It's like any number of other groups or atoms is being symbolized by R. It could be something large, it could just be one hydrogen atom, it could be anything. It's like a variable in algebra. Also in the diagrams, carbon is often abbreviated by only showing the bonds between carbons as lines. So here you see an ibuprofen molecule. They show some of the carbon involved, but they also have these vertices, or the points where these lines meet. The lines are chemical bonds, and at the end is carbon. And if it doesn't tell you anything else, you could assume that the carbons have hydrogen atoms bonded wherever there would be room. They just don't show the carbon or hydrogen to simplify the diagram. Here's our first functional group. It's called OH. It's the hydroxyl group. By itself, OH would be called an hydroxide ion. Chemicals with OH groups on them can sometimes be called variations of alcohol. It can be called an alcohol group. The bond between the oxygen and hydrogen makes this molecule hydrophilic. Functional groups like the hydroxyl group can often be found in sugars. So there's our first functional group. It has effects to change the properties of the molecules building off of a carbon skeleton. The next functional group is called the carboxyl group. It's a carbon double bonded to an oxygen here and bonded to an oxygen that's also bonded to a hydrogen over there. The other of the four covalent bonds of the carbon goes to something represented with an R group. Carboxyl groups are important parts of proteins and fats. The carboxyl group will make the substance more acidic. This hydrogen gets donated to an aqueous solution, which increases the hydrogen ion concentration, which would lower the pH, making something more acidic. For example, here's lactic acid. There's some carbons, and there's a hydroxyl group, but there's also this full carboxyl group, and so that makes this lactic acid. The next functional group is called the amino group. It's a nitrogen with two hydrogens involved. You can see the name of chemicals with nitrogen in them often have that sound. This is an amino group, but there's also ammonia. That AM sound of the word is a hint that you're talking about something with nitrogen in it. Nitrogen is an important part of living things, and the amino acids in proteins have an amino group here and a carboxyl group over there, and so that's why these chemicals are called amino acids. The acid part comes from the carboxyl group, and they have an amino group in them too. Finally, we have the phosphate group. This is a phosphorus atom bonded with 4 oxygens and 2 hydrogens there as well. All of these electronegative oxygens make it very polar. Phosphate groups are part of DNA and the fats that make up cell membranes. So far we've seen carbon and functional groups. Now, as we lead into talking about the macromolecule groups, we can talk about monomers and polymers. Monomers are the subunits of macromolecules. The root word mono means one. Now, each different kind of macromolecule group has its own monomers. DNA has 4 different possible monomers. Those are called nucleotides. On the other hand, proteins, a different group, has 20 different monomers, and those are the amino acids. So the monomers are like the beads on a chain, and when you link those beads together, you have a polymer. A polymer is a series of monomers bonded together, just like train cars making up a longer train. The process of bonding monomers together to form a polymer can be called polymerization. Making polymers can be caused by a reaction called dehydration synthesis, or it's also called a condensation reaction. So here we see how polymers can be made from monomers. The monomers bond together to form a polymer. That's the synthesis part, something is being made. But from two hydroxyl groups from the two separate monomers, a water molecule comes out. The water coming out is why it's called dehydration. And it leaves the two monomers together in what's called a dimer. Di meaning two, and so we went from mono for one to one bigger molecule, a dimer. When this happens again and again and again, we can get a polymer. So we're building a polymer. This was just the first step. It can also be called a condensation reaction because condensation involves water coming out of something. This is part of our metabolism. This is how all living things process the nutrients they get and build their own bodies as part of being alive. Now, the opposite of a dehydration reaction is hydrolysis. That's splitting a monomer, or it's splitting a polymer, or lysing, by adding water back in. So hydro is the water, and to lyse means to break up, and so it's splitting or breaking things up. This is also part of metabolism through digestion. When we eat food or take in chemicals and nutrients that we need, we break them up before we can use them as raw materials to build them back up into other chemicals and molecules we need. So, in this video, we looked at why carbon is important and useful for life. We looked at the functional groups that can grow off of carbon backbones. Well, not grow, but be placed there. We looked at what monomers and polymers are, and finally how monomers and polymers interact through dehydration synthesis and hydrolysis reactions. Thanks for watching. I hope this helps. Have a good day. Bye.